Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you everyone for taking the time to come to this session. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and I'm really looking forward to engaging in a discussion about approaches to developing digital content. So as mentioned, a quick note about the format. This session was designed to be a workshop, and so I'm hoping it will be fairly interactive. I have 5 main points that I'm going to cover today, and for each of those points, I'm going to speak for roughly 5 minutes, and then I'll open the floor for discussion for about 5 minutes, and that's going to happen 5 times. So that'll probably take up pretty much the entire session. So as noted in the introduction, my name is Lisa Peterson, and I'm the Director of Development. And I manage the project managers and editors who work with our national textbook authors. So from the point of the book proposal being accepted right through to handover to our production team. So in that regard, Top Hat is actually very similar to the traditional print-based publishing houses, with the exception that we are digital first. And for those who aren't familiar with Top Hat, just very, very briefly, Top Hat is an ed tech company that offers an authoring platform to give instructors the ability to create their own content for the classroom or customize our existing national textbooks or OER content. So I'm not going to, spend any time really talking about Top Hat. That's just for context. So as mentioned, I've worked in the publishing industry for 20 years. And I actually spent the bulk of my career in the print-based world. So over the years, I've watched the companies that I worked for, and I come from Canada, but it's very much the same across the board, I think, Canada and the US. I've watched the companies that I've worked for invest a great deal of time and resources into creating digital solutions that never quite hit the mark. So I've seen platforms come and go, and above all, customer reluctance to shift from print to digital, even though the student body consuming the content has been in the digital space since the moment they could hold an iPhone. I'm assuming that many of you are here today because you're interested in working in the digital space, or you're working with a company who is finding their way in the digital space. So I'm really hoping that that today we can work together to talk about some of the strategies that we use at Top Hat that you might be able to use in your work. So I think it's fair to say that the fundamental reason why there is a reluctance for individuals to shift to digital is because we're still largely retrofitting our print content into the digital space. So there's no one-to-one correlation between the print experience and the digital experience. Just because something is digital doesn't mean that it's satisfying the needs of today's students. So many of the students, textbooks that students today are using were written probably maybe over 20 years ago as a starting point. If it's on the 8th edition or the 9th edition, that was originally developed quite some time ago. Those books were not developed necessarily for digital delivery. They didn't incorporate inclusive pedagogy, and they were published pretty much at a moment in time with content not changing until the next update or revision. I think we're all familiar with that process. So textbooks were ultimately written for a very different profile. So the bottom line here is that retrofitting print content for the digital only solves the problem of the medium. What was print is now digital, but the medium itself doesn't solve the learning experience problems. So where do we go from here? Well, in my experience at Top Hat, a certain proportion of the work that we actually do has been through the ingestion of print textbooks into the digital space. And it's that process that's largely informed the guidelines that I'm going to be talking today. And that these are the guidelines that we're starting to build at Top Hat to ensure that our digital first content serves the needs of instructors and students. So when retrofitting content to the digital space, we often found that we would be dealing with things such as ineffective or ill-defined outcomes, low value or no interactions, lack of accessibility and inclusive design, and poorly built assessment and feedback. So it was through this process that we really landed on the idea that you need to be extremely intentional intentional, sorry, about what we are building and how we are building it. So in essence, great digital experiences really become intentional. And so that's sort of the theme that runs through today. So to that end, I'm going to walk us through 5 pillars. As I mentioned, there will be 5 today for creating compelling digital content. And these are the things that we think and we have found must be considered if you're going to create digital content that's more than just a retrofit of your print content to digital. So I'd also really like to underscore before we move on that what I'm presenting here is not a magic bullet. It's not a solution. We're still very much on a journey to digital, into the digital space, even though we're a digital first company and we're learning a lot. And so we still have work to do to land on an optimal solution, but this is where we're starting. So the 5 pillars are objective aligned content, intentional interactions, accessible content, inclusive design, and assessment and feedback. So it's these 5 pillars that we now state as the must-haves that we recommend to anybody who builds content in the Top Hat platform, whether or not they're a national author, like many of you probably in this room, or a custom author, or even an individual author who builds their own content. So to that end, each of the sections that we're going to discuss looks at our best practices. And then I'm going to open the floor so we can talk about what your experiences with each of these particular pillars has been, and whether or not you have any suggestions or recommendations that you would like to make to the room, or just even observations. And I'd also like to point out that some of the pillars that I'm discussing today are driven by the work and the nature of the platform that I work in. So depending on what type of content you are building, not all of these might work for you, but I'm still hoping that you will take something away from today. So without further ado, let's take a look at the very first pillar, which is objective aligned content. So at Top Hat, objective aligned content really refers to the organization of our text narrative, our interactive elements such as videos and polls and assessments, and that would be both formative and summative assessments by learning objective. And I'm sure that many of you who work on textbooks are familiar with a learning objective-based approach. So this is nothing new that I'm presenting here. However, one thing that I will say is that the reason why objectives are so important in the digital space is that it really provides a very, very explicit framework for when you're constructing your content. It helps provide a really measurable and accurate snapshot of the overall outcomes that the text achieves, and it really helps instructors see how your text aligns to their course syllabus. It provides students with a clear path learning through the material, and finally, it gives them insights into the learning objectives that they have mastery over. And I would also say that learning objectives, if there's any one thing that we really recommend people do to get their digital content up to snuff, I suppose I'll say, is really to put firm learning objectives in place. So I've created this little funnel here. And we'll go through the 4 different types of questions that we ask our content developers to consider as they're creating their objective aligned content. So for all content creation, the first thing that we focus on is the desired outcome. And the key question that you want to ask at this stage is, what are students going to be able to do upon completion of the course or the chapter? And a secondary but no less critical question that underpins this outcome is, what are the key teaching and learning challenges that you want to solve? Once you figure out what those key teaching and learning challenges that you need to solve in the digital space are, that will really help direct your content creation. So generally speaking, the course outcome and the teaching and learning challenges are what you should keep in mind when you start to create your learning objectives that become the framework of your course. And the key question that you should ask at this stage is, how will each of the objectives help students achieve the course outcome up here. So just very briefly, we define learning objectives probably very much in the same way that you do at Top Hat. It's the specific and measurable knowledge and skills that students have acquired upon completion of each unit of study. So following the objectives, we have content. And the key question that we have here is, how will the content support the successful completion of each objective? And again, for clarity, content refers to all of the text narrative, any of the interactive elements that we put in our text, images and graphs, etc. So our recommendation, and this is pretty much the heart of this, is that all of the content that lives within an A head section of a text has a one-to-one correlation to each learning objective. So in practical terms, that means that if you have 5 learning objectives in your content, you should have 5 main sections of content in your chapter. And then finally, one more thing that I would say about that is if you're all of the content that's within an A head section really should serve the learning objective. And if you're really unable to answer that question on how the content will support the objective, then you really need to start to rethink the content, in that it needs to either be more robust or perhaps be folded into a previous section. And then finally, we have assessments. And these are the testing tool that help measure whether or not the student has gained mastery over the objective aligned content. So when creating your assessments, you should ask, does this assessment test the understanding of the content? And all 3 of those elements taken together really bring us back to the top of our course funnel, which is the course outcome. We do have some very general guidelines on how we create learning objectives, and then I'm going to open the floor to everybody. So what we ask people to do is to include 4 to 7 within their book, ensure that every single learning objective corresponds to 1 A head per chapter, ensure that each learning objective is presented in the order that the A heads appear, and ensure that each objective describes something that the learner will be able to do. And finally, ensure that each objective accurately reflects the content within the section that it's linked to. So I know that this sounds pretty obvious perhaps to some of you, especially those who are seasoned textbook writers. However, you'd be surprised at the number of textbooks that we do encounter that don't have objectives. And when you're in the digital space, as I mentioned, it really helps create that learning path through the material. So I'd love to open up the floor right now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment so that I can see everybody. And I'd really love to entertain any questions or comments that you have. In particular, I'd love to know what everyone's experience here, or anybody's experience here, is with learning objectives. How do you use them? Do you find them valuable? Please feel free to put your comments in the chat or just come off mute if you have any.
This is a 1962 book called Preparing Instructional Objectives by Major, and it has been republished over and over again, but my original copy, I would recommend that people read this, because you don't want to have objectives that say understand or know, or you want to have operative objectives like derive, contrast, write, recite, identify, differentiate, and so on. And Major's book will help launch your instructional objective. You've heard of this book, yes.
Thanks very much, Robert. And I think what you're underscoring is that objectives are tried and true. So just because we're moving into the digital space, in fact, doesn't mean that we should take them away.
No, they should be there.
They should absolutely be there. And I think depending on the types of platforms that people are working in, they're going to be used differently in the platform. We're looking toward a day at Top Hat where all of our content can be tagged to each learning objective, so that you can have a much fuller idea of basically a snapshot of all of the assessments, all of the videos, all of the homework questions that are linked to each objective. So that's the dream. But
Well,
thank you for sharing that.
We took my big book, which has learning objectives in every chapter, and then made a modular version of 2-page spreads, but each 2-page spread has learning objectives, and broke it down into those compartments for the digital.
Nice.
Hey, Robert, could you put the name and author of that book in the chat, please? People have been asking for that.
Okay.
So Diane Carius, you use LOs routinely for every lecture. They're embedded within the lecture, accompanying the handout. Review objectives, which make explicit the previous materials and the new material. Handout has a brief review of each objective. Thank you very much. Has anybody had an experience outside of what I've discussed here, or would like to share alternative approaches that they take? If not, that's fine. We can launch ahead. We don't have a lot of time, I believe. So Kevin, would you say fair enough?
Sure.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to share my screen again. And you're able to see, perfect. Okay. Great. So next I'm going to move into intentional interactions defined. So this is where we're really starting to get into the heart of the power of the digital platform and what you can do if you are working in the platform to really, really improve the engagement in that digital space. So as we define it, intentional interactions are really interactive touch points that foster active learning to improve insights into if and how your students are learning. So just as a reminder for those, or new knowledge for those who may not be familiar with it, active learning is really the process of engaging students in the learning process. And that's really the power and the impressive thing that you can do with the digital space. Mind you, you can still do it in a regular classroom space, but if we are transitioning to digital, you want to really consider what you can do in your platform. And finally, insights are derived from the collection and analysis of student data. In my world at Top Hat, we can actually collect data on whether or not students are doing their reading based on answering questions that are interspersed throughout the text, their engagement with those questions. And all of those insights are derived through the different interactions that we've built. So there are 3 types of intentional interactions. This is not in anything that we have created. This research comes from M.G. Moore, 1989, 3 types of interactions from the American Journal of Distance Education. And actually these types of interactions have really become the benchmark for how different institutions actually measure the efficacy of courseware. So the first type of interaction that we have is student to content. And these are the engagement opportunities that facilitate active learning within a digital space. So it's whether or not it's critical reflection and analysis or assessment and practice. It's basically all of the interactions that students have to the content, whether that's just reading the text, but more importantly, the videos, the types of questions that you're asking of students. The next type of interaction to really consider when you're creating digital content is what is the student-to-student interaction? Are there opportunities or ways for students to have meaningful collaboration and open dialogue? And finally, student-to-instructor. This is opportunities within your digital space for instructor-led emphasis on important topics to expand students' thoughts and knowledge through prompts and content. So just very, very briefly, I'm going to talk about some of the things that we do at Top Hat to accomplish these 3 types of interactions. So for student to content, we really emphasize interspersing questions in line within the text. And that's something that we can do in our platform. So the whole idea is that students are going to read a little bit of content, then they're going to do a little bit, which is answer some of the questions about the content that they just encountered. Videos are also another really effective tool that we have found for engaging students with the content. So alternate ways of presenting the same textual material. We often use third-party assets such as thing links, which is the ability to take a picture and embed it with hotspots that pop up additional material for students to use. And we also like to include hints and explanations for any of the formative assessments that we have directly in the platform. Student to student, our platform also gives us the ability to promote inline or in-class discussion questions. Student to student opportunities just to see what your peer is doing is a really very important tool to use to engage students to improve their understanding of the content, but also to really see and learn from their peers. And polls, that's another thing that that we typically use. And then finally, student to instructor. One of the things that you can do is embed metacognitive questions within the content. So I'm not quite sure how agile any of the platforms that many of you work on are, but our platform does allow you to customize and change content. So if you have a chapter reading, you can actually go in and type a metacognitive question just before the content that the students are going to read in that class. So for example, you could ask a question, you know, what do you know about this topic? Before students come to the classroom, and that can be embedded directly in the content, at least in the Top Hat world. You can leave personalized notes for your students directly in your digital content saying, remember we talked about this last week? This is really important. This really, you know, starts to pull in, you know, some of the content that we've already discussed. You could also embed questions such as, you know, how does observing this help you understand the concept? Or what did you find difficult? What would you like to know about this topic? So this is the sort of on the fly thing on the fly. These are the sorts of on the fly things that you can do with your content to improve those types of interactions. All right, so commentary and questions. I would love to hear again from the room on different approaches that you've taken with these three types of interactions. Anybody have any thoughts?
Hi, hello.
Hi, Shal, is that how to,
Yes.
hi, nice to meet you.
Or that's what it's called, yes. Is it a Canadian company or are you just Canadian? I'm curious.
I'm Canadian. It's a Canadian company. However, we work most of our adopters are in the United States. So it's most of our clients are American.
Okay, just props to Canada. My son just graduated from University of Waterloo, so.
Oh, I'm in Waterloo. I can see the campus. So.
And I want to ask, does your company send out examination copies for instructors to get a sampling of what a digitized book on your platform looks like?
You can actually go directly to the platform and take a look at a sample chapter from most of our national textbooks. And that will give you a sense of the flow and how interactive that content is. You can also set up a demo and somebody will walk you through the platform, and in particular, how to customize content specifically so that as an instructor, it suits your needs.
Good, thank you.
No problem. Hi, Anda.
Good morning. I had two questions. The first is, does the software have a skip logic kind of embedded in it? So students have to go to each of those questions before they can move forward into the content. And the second is whether or not students can design their own experience within that in the platform with some of the materials. So can they bring in things that they help their learning in their learning style, or might help them in some way, so they can have some personal design in that?
Oh, those are really good questions. So to answer your first one, no, unfortunately, there is no skip logic. So students can hop around in the content. The one thing though that instructors can control is when the content is released for students to respond to, so they can just chunk it out a chapter at a time rather than the whole book. As for students being able to customize their own space, unfortunately, that capability doesn't exist. The customization is a professor side tool only. But one of the beauties of that is, and we'll get that to that once we get to the fourth pillar, is the ability to customize content so that it's reflective of all users. So that instructors can start to bring in once they learn their student body, then they can start to pull in examples that resonate with their students. So that's one of the tools that we have. But thank you, that's a great question. Jocelyn, just looking at your comment. Students need to answer metacognitive questions about their own writing, right? Yes, extremely important.
I have a quick question. You
Sure.
were just talking about the customization part,
Yeah.
and that professors can pull in examples that are relevant to their
Mhm.
situation or their students.
Yeah.
When you say pull them in, is there a library of existing things that they could pull from, or are you referring to things that they would develop themselves?
Things that they would develop themselves. That's a
Okay.
great question, Kevin. Thanks for asking for the clarity on that. So so one recommendation that we often make is do an intake survey with your students. Find out where they come from, what they're interested in learning, and you can just customize any of the in-text samples to actually reflect that, but we don't actually have a library. Office in the Philippines or maybe Singapore. No, we don't. Robert, that's can you clarify on your question, Roberto? No.
Yeah, he may be able to add
Okay.
that later.
Yeah, sure.
I have a question.
Our time is up
Oh,
for this
Okay,
session.
that's
So
okay.
oh, okay. Would you like to put it in the chat and then I can address it later?
oh, he put in there, I don't know if you saw that, he just finds your company interesting.
Oh, okay. Fine.
So,
And yeah, thank you. And sorry, who else was going to ask the other question?
I'm sorry.
Cassandra? Sure. Okay. I will move on.
No,
Okay.
I don't have a question. I just thought it was a great session, and just by listening to you, I generated some ideas for the revision of my book, and I'm looking forward to exploring Top Hat.
Excellent. Wonderful. So I will move on then. Thank you so much. And we're going to talk now a little bit about accessible content, and that being another critical thing that we consider when we're creating our content. So accessible content is a must-have, and content that is designed without keeping accessibility in mind will result in students left behind. So accessible content really is course content that is perceivable by those primarily, but not exclusively, with varying degrees of sensory mobility and cognitive functions. Why is it important? Well, accessibility not just helps the users who typically need it, but it can generally help all users. think of an example. Many people might listen to or watch programs with closed captioning on just because there's a noisy environment that they're in. So I think it's a point of universal design. The more users that we can include, the more robust and better our content is. Another reason why we really consider accessible content, and why you probably should as well when you're building your own textbook in a digital space, is that meeting the WCAG standards is a success criteria that's increasingly required amongst universities and colleges, particularly when they are making decisions around which courseware they're going to adopt. So for anybody here who is already working in the digital space, you might find that it's now become a requirement to ensure that your content is accessible. So I'm going to go through the 8 different buckets of accessibility that we consider when writing content. And what I would say is I will only touch on briefly on some of the things that we do. Our guidelines are very, very extensive, and we spend a lot of time ensuring that all of the content in our digital platform is accessible. So the first thing is text. A few of the key things that we do with our text when it's in a digital platform is we ensure that, number one, that it follows a logical hierarchy. So that brings us back to our learning objectives and our course outcomes. We also like to avoid certain types of sensory language in our text. So rather than say, watch this video, or as you have seen, we can say things like review the video or consider this. And it's just a way of it's not saying that we're going to exclude all sensory language, but just understanding that it's exclusive when you're making assumptions about a person's abilities. When it comes to connecting to links that go outside of our platform, we always include descriptive links. So rather than saying, click here, click the guidelines on how to write accessible content. And then your link would be the guidelines. That's one simple thing that you can do right away. Tables, another thing that you can do quite quickly and easily to make your content accessible with tables is to ensure that your tables are data only, and that you have a header for every single column, and that you avoid merged cells. For people who are using screen readers with digital content, merged cells can be problematic. Cells that have visuals in them can be problematic. So really use a table for the purpose that it's intended, which is for data. Questions. Ensure that your questions are accessible. So if you're working in a digital platform and your question type requires vision to understand it, such as it has a picture, you should ensure that your question either has an accessible alternative for those who might not be able to see the photo, or ensure that if you do have a photo in your question that students need to refer to, that image has alternate text so that a blind or partially sighted user is also able to access that content. When it comes to images, just going back to what I said, all images should have alternate text that describes the content of the image. And if the image is complex, and your alt text field, which is usually limited to about 150 characters, you can use a long description field so that you can create a much more fulsome description of the text, so that blind or partially sighted users will also have access to that content. When it comes to time-based media, so time-based media is really, it's the way WCAG describes videos. Is any video or content, you should make sure that the closed captioning is enabled when you are embedding or using video content. You could also, or should also, ensure that described video is available. And if not, we like to write a transcript that describes any visual elements that are in the video, so that, again, blind or partially sighted users can access that content as well. When it comes to embedded interactives, so I mentioned thing links a little bit earlier, or biodigitals, you might be familiar with those two particular third-party embedded content facilities. We like to include alt text or long descriptions in those. For PowerPoints, we follow a logical reading order. We ensure that every PowerPoint slide has a unique heading, except I see now that I've actually broken that rule in my presentation, and I don't necessarily have a unique heading on one of my on all of my slides, so that's my bad. And then finally, for PDFs, we also ensure that we have a logical reading order for anybody who is using a screen reader. And I have one example to show you that demonstrates one way that you can take a graph that's in color and ensure that it's accessible for somebody who is colorblind, for example. So if you take a look at the left-hand side of this, if we had this particular graph with just color only, when it's in black and white, somebody who is colorblind would not be able to distinguish between each of the columns. So one thing that we do is we ensure that our graphs not only have appropriate color contrast for background, but we also ensure that there are patterns included so that a person who is colorblind will still be able to derive the information required from this graph. You can see that this will also work in a print medium. It's just good practice to do that. So that's one example of one of the things that we do with our content. So there's a lot there. Are maps considered text or images? Maps are great. Oh yeah, maps, we would consider maps an image in our world. And so we would write alt text for those. And again, I'd love to open the floor to comments that, and oh, I see we are actually probably pretty close to running up on time again. It's already 2:16. We have 15 minutes left, Kevin?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
And there is a question though that came in early in this section though from Terry Thompson. She said, Lisa, looking at your slide diagram of the 3 types of interactions, I noticed that all the arrows were one way. I was thinking, if we really want to fully intentional interactions, shouldn't we be trying to make each of those a 2-way arrow? For example, can we design digital content that initiates students to produce some learning tool or study notes or so on?
That's a really, really, really excellent point. Certainly, study notes is something that we can do at Top Hat in our platform, and I didn't mention that, but that is, sorry, who made that comment?
It's Terry Thompson.
Terry Thompson, thank you for that. I think that is an exceptional point and something that I will reflect on in terms of how to improve this presentation and also improve my thinking on digital as well. I think that's a really great point. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're caught up with the questions.
Sure. Does anyone have any questions about accessibility in general, or different experiences that they've had with accessible content and creating it?
Yeah, I have had an issue. My field is human anatomy and physiology, and we have among our textbooks a big 2-semester textbook, so it's like full of lots of content, some of it very detailed, and it's very visual. So we have lots of complex diagrams, and it kind of relates to Robert's question a moment ago about maps, because I'm sure some of his I know because I have at least one of his books here and have looked through it, that are very detailed. And so when you use alt text, you can't write another whole chapter in there. And to me, some of that alt text is pretty useless that I've seen. If someone does, has a visual impairment or whatever and is relying on that alt text, it's not going to help them, at least not much. But the second thing is we talk about assessment. So when you ask a question about that diagram, like, look at a picture of the whole body and like, well, where are the axillary lymph nodes? And there's hundreds of lymph nodes in that diagram. How can you your image embedded in your question has to have alt text. How can you describe that whole thing and then also describe it in a way that doesn't give away the answer?
Exactly. Those are definitely some of the things that we bump up against constantly when we're writing alt text. So the first thing that I would say is one of the guiding principles when it comes to writing alt text is you could have different alt text for the same image depending on use case. So really, when it comes down to it, I think the author is always the person who's best placed to write the alt text because they know what the intention of that particular image is and what content needs to be derived from that image. So the alt text doesn't necessarily have to describe every single thing in that image to answer your question. I think it just needs to get to the heart of what is the content that the student without sight will need to be able to understand in order to answer the question associated. That's the element that needs to be described. But as you say, the tricky thing is to describe it in such a way as not to give away the answer. That is a situation when we might then go to an alternate question. So a question that will accomplish the same thing, but not need that photo. And so those are the considerations that we take when creating alt text for images with assessments. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks.
One quick comment, in a science textbooks illustrated, I've always suggested to everyone that your key illustrations, even some photographs, maps, images, tables, graphs, have those laid out prior to writing and illustrations, the maps, the diagrams and photos, and the text. And then also the captions are a dynamic part of the interactivity between the illustration and the text. And so a captions manuscript open at the same time. So that accessibility to me is enhanced for students if the writer does that gymnastic and produces it integrated.
100% integrated is I love to hear that word. Integrated accessibility is something that we also like to think about when it comes to creating ground up videos. How can you create that video in such a way that you're already targeting some of the main issues that we currently need alt text to solve? So that's a really great point. I think I'm going to have to continue on if we're going to get to those last two buckets before the session ends.
My timer just went off anyway. So.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. All right. Our next one is inclusive design. And this is a really, really important and critical one that I love that we really reflect on and employ at Top Hat. So content that is reflective of all users really takes the principles of inclusive pedagogy into consideration during the content development to ensure that the content is reflective of all users. So studies have shown that students actually learn better when they see themselves reflected in the content, as in the names that they come across reflect their experience. The types of people that they see in images reflect their experience. So it's also, I would say, not just about ensuring global representation of your student body, but also local. So who is in your classroom? Find out who's in your classroom and find out how can you reflect them in the content that you've created. So what I would really highlight for any adopter of a textbook or creator of content is that you have the opportunity, if you have the opportunity to diversify your content, that's really one that you should seize on. So what is inclusive pedagogy? Just very briefly, it's an approach that aims to make learning as accessible and welcome and as rich as possible for all students. And it seeks to embed equitable access and opportunity for access within the classroom and curriculum. And one thing that I'm just going to really quickly walk through is one of the quick and easy things that you can do in your classroom to make it, or in your content to make it accessible. So in your content, you can start by avoiding or explaining culturally specific references, because that centers, in a sense, a very Western perspective by doing so. You can diversify the names of people and examples. You can be inclusive when it comes to the different authors or types of research that you're pulling in. So if there are opportunities to pull in a diverse body of authors, that would be a great thing to do, as well as include different illustrative examples that reflect a more diverse body of research. And finally, you could also include statements about the accessibility of your content in your syllabus. So I'd love to hear some ideas very, very briefly in the last 5 minutes, and I still have assessments to get through, of how others have improved inclusivity in their content. Does anybody have an example? Okay.
Well, it's a geographic example, but to avoid hemispheric prejudice, we would say,
oh yeah,
we would say December solstice, but but in the northern hemisphere we say winter solstice. So I went through and adjusted the wording so that adopters in Australia would know the December solstice, even though it was summer there.
That's a really
winter. So that's a nerdy example, but there are better examples, of course.
But it is a great point.
This is Cassandra. I have to agree. I hope I didn't cut you off. I have to agree. I use, instead of using his or her, I use their.
Yeah.
To have more inclusive language. I'm working on a textbook now, and I try to have a wide variety of, I'm working on leadership textbooks, and I try to have a wide variety of people from all backgrounds, from all cultures. And so it can reflect more of the student body today. And it's more difficult than you think. So it's, that's one of the ways I try to look at diversity and inclusion in the language and in what I show as examples.
Thank you, Cassandra. I think those are excellent points, and I commend you for doing that. Thank you. And I think I saw.
We're trying to use gender neutral international names in our examples.
Yes, that's a great example. All right, I think I should run on to the very, very last one before we go on. And I'm very sorry that we don't have time to go into great depth as much as I had hoped. Finally, assessment and feedback. So the final bucket that we have is ensuring that we have formative and summative assessments that test student mastery over learning objective aligned content. So we like to strategically integrate our assessments throughout the content rather than just keep them at the end. So I will just jump ahead to this slide. So when it comes to formative assessments, we really like to encourage spaced practice. So we assign those in the before, during, and after phases. So before they come to class, within their lectures, and after. We place questions very strategically throughout reading passages. I think I've mentioned this before. So students are reading a little and then they're doing a little. We increase the level of difficulty. And we also tag our questions to our learning objectives. And I'm just going to give you a very quick visual before we run out, just to show you what an interactive textbook might look like compared to a traditional. So a traditional textbook, we might have section A, section B, and then a whole bunch of homework questions at the end. The highest level of interactivity activity that we really like to go for is in a digital space, is putting those questions and videos very much throughout the entire text, so that students are constantly being tested on their mastery over the content. They're engaging with the content. Some of these interactives might be some student to student or student to content interactions, or even student to instructor. So the whole idea is that all of these pillars really ultimately work together in order to create a much richer digital experience. And finally, I would just remind you that this is digital learning first phase, right? So we still have a long way to go. I think everybody into creating truly interactive content. So it's definitely a journey. It's one that I'm really happy to be on, and I'm just thrilled that I was able to share my thoughts on this with you today. I'm sorry that it wasn't quite, we didn't have as much time to interact as I had hoped, but I am definitely available at any point if anyone wants to reach out to me to talk about any of this in more detail. My email is lisa.peterson@tophatmonocle.com. So thank you very much, Kevin and Kim, for moderating the session, and thank you all for joining.
Well, that was great, Lisa. I really learned a lot myself, and I can tell by the interaction that others did as well. And so we're completely out of time, but do get a hold of Lisa if you have questions or comments